Joining me now, Harry Litman. He's here in studio. He is former Deputy Assistant Attorney General, now LA Times Senior Legal Affairs columnist and host of the podcast Talking Feds. Harry's been in this courtroom all week long. Thank you very much for that. Also with us, our good friend Timothy Hafey, former federal prosecutor and former lead investigator to the January 6th Select Committee. Welcome to you, Tim. Okay. I want you to set the scene for us, Harry. What has it been like there in the courtroom? What is it that you've been able to see from your vantage point that we have not?
The jury, first and foremost, how attentive they are, if they're more attentive for one side or the other. The defendant for another, who sometimes has been a little bit sleepy and even nodded off. And then just a little bit of sort of hubbub as what seems to be dramatic moments have occurred. You know, the sort of hush, whoa, when somewhat dramatic moments in trial have occurred.
I'm curious about David Pecker particularly. I want to get sure of what you called him here, an affable scoundrel. But what is your assessment of the case, and what do you think the jury took away from this week?
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, he's a sleaze merchant, but he was totally unabashed about it. I think he came across as very credible. And there were two really important parts of his testimony. Most importantly, he sets the tracks that go from Dino the doorman all the way to the precipice of Stormy Daniels, which is where we are starting now. And what he makes really clear is that it's all about buoying Trump's campaign and staving off these crises. He actually testified, consistent with what your reporter just said, Trump never mentioned Melania or family, was all about that. The second thing he does that's strong is he prospectively corroborates what Michael Cohen, who's in for a bruising cross-examination, they've taken to calling him, the defense, just Cohen, not even Mr. Cohen. But he corroborates much of what he's going to say. And I think in general, they're designing their case to be sure that Cohen's testimony, which I think will be in the broad middle of the case somewhere, is substantiated by Hope Hicks, by David Pecker, and by the paper. In other words, they're not relying on him alone. A pretty effective week for the prosecution, in particular, the Pecker, both credible, but also making it clear this is about the campaign, nothing else.
So, Tim, Pecker agreed a story about a porn star having a relationship with a presidential candidate would have been National Enquirer gold, could have taken that to the bank. But he had zero intention of publishing and killed it, in fact, because it would have hurt Trump. So what's the significance of this, and what is the extent of the sacrifice that Pecker was making to help Trump?
Yeah, he's making a big financial sacrifice, Alex. It certainly would have been better for sales of the National Enquirer if it's got a screaming headline about an alleged extramarital affair between a presidential candidate and a porn star. Rather than print that story, he agrees not to, for directly to benefiting the Trump campaign. The significance of that is that that's the underlying crime. It's, as Harry said, it sort of is the predicate reason for the falsification of the records, right? The government has to prove that these records were falsified for the underlying purpose of protecting the campaign. These were payments that were effectively campaign contributions. They benefited the campaign, but they were falsely labeled as invoices for legal services, mislabeled. So while the former president's not being charged for this alleged affair, he's being charged for doing something that benefits his campaign and then essentially hiding that. That's why the Pecker testimony is so pertinent.
And another thing, Tim, he takes us inside Trump Tower on that day, January 6th of 2017, describing walking in to find James Comey, Sean Spicer, Reince Priebus, and Mike Pompeo. He says Trump is cracking some kind of a bad joke about Pecker having more intel than everyone else in the room. And when they all left, Trump asked about McDougal. How's my girl, our girl, doing? But Comey also wrote about that meeting, saying that he and other intelligence representatives were there to brief Trump on salacious details in the so-called Russian dossier. So, Tim, what comes to mind when you think about this scenario?
Yeah, look, it's, again, corroborative of the underlying predicate for the payment, right? My understanding, Harry's been in court, I have not, but my understanding is that the defendant is denying all of these alleged affairs. The recounting of a conversation in which President Trump, then President Trump, asks about my girl Karen, goes directly against that. And see, trials, Alex, are ultimately about credibility. And if a jury starts to disbelieve what a particular witness or the defendant says, either directly or through counsel, that infects the entire proceeding, right? At bottom, these things are sort of core assessments of credibility. So if the president's lawyer stands up an opening statement and he says, all these were false allegations, and the president was trying to essentially prevent these false allegations from being aired. Then you hear from David Pecker this story about how's my girl Karen doing? It undercuts the credibility of the lawyer and his client. That has a pervasive effect, potentially has a pervasive effect on the way the jurors see all the evidence. Because again, a lot of this really comes down to assessment of credibility.
Interesting. So we have Trump's former executive assistant, Rona Graff, who says, first of all, she is being paid, rather her attorneys are being paid by Trump's lawyers. Let me make sure I get that straight. But she has multiple phone numbers for Karen McDougal. She's got a cell phone as well for Stormy Daniels. She even saw Stormy Daniels sitting out in the waiting room at some point. This is a woman who is known as Trump's gatekeeper. So give me a sense of what prosecutors wanted to get from her. She was only on the stand for a short while.
That's right. They would have wanted to get from her everything because she knows everything. They got from her next to nothing. All they really did was go through evidentiary hoops so they can now use the contacts and the calendar. And it was plain she was very friendly. The defense walked her through a little recitation of what a nice boss he was. And here's something I saw in the courtroom that I think people missed. As she left the stand, Trump stood up, who, as I said, was sleeping much, stood up and went to embrace her. Extremely improper in front of the jury, and the guards immediately pushed him back. She had a broad smile, and she was ushered out. So it was plain that she's so friendly that the prosecutor said, we better stay away from this. Just a quick point to what Tim had to say. Credibility matters, and another white-collar defense lawyer would say, look, here's how we should play this. Cop to the affairs, say you're kind of a sleazy guy, but not a criminal. But you can't do that with Trump because he's insisting on the truth of, I never slept with Stormy, I never slept with McDougal. And that, exactly as Tim says, freights the whole credibility, especially if, as I think will be the case, he doesn't testify and it goes to the jury, you know, we believe Trump or we believe everyone else. That's too big a weight for him to try to carry, I think.
Yeah. And in fact, Tim Pecker also testified that he spoke to Hope Hicks as well as Sarah Sanders. It happened during a call from the White House, and he was explaining to them why he planned to extend McDougal's hush money contract. What kind of concerns does this raise for you that White House staffers were aware and, you know, somewhat involved?
Yeah, it again, Alex, connects these payments to some kind of political benefit for the president. These were not completely unrelated personal issues. They had a very direct and practical impact on his political status as a candidate and then even after the election. One of the things that's striking here is how many people close to the defendant, the former president, will testify. Part of I think the success, candidly, of the select committee's hearings and our process was how many of our witnesses were longtime Republicans who were, officials of the Trump administration and people close to him, including his family. That gave them more credibility, right? These are not people that are leaping forward to hurt with some bias the defendant. So when you call people like Hope Hicks or Rona Graff, hard to argue that they have a bias to lie or to disparage the former president. That, again, gives them more credibility. And as we keep talking about, trials are ultimately about jurors' relative assessment of who's telling the truth.
Okay. I'd like you both to stay with me, please, because